Selena Voss picked up the place card with 2 fingers, the way you'd handle something that didn't belong on a clean table, and moved it without a word. No hesitation, no glance toward Nia, just a quiet, deliberate act of erasure, performed in front of 14 members of one of the most powerful families in the city. Nia watched it happen from 3 feet away. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. She simply stood there in a silk dress that had taken her 40 minutes to choose because she'd wanted, just once, to feel like she belonged in that house, and watched her name get relocated to the far end of the table, near the kitchen door where the servers came and went. That was the night everything changed. Not because of what Selena did, because of how long Nia had already been absorbing it silently, alone, in a marriage she was fighting to protect from the inside. If that were you, would you have said something? Or would you have done exactly what Nia did, smiled, straightened your dress, and sat down in the wrong chair? Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Stories like this one don't come around often, and I don't want you missing what happens next. And while you're watching, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're viewing from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The first time Nia Holloway met Roman Voss, she was not impressed. That's the part of the story she never told anyone, because by the time people heard her name alongside his, they assumed she'd been swept off her feet, that she'd seen the cars, the suits, the way a room reorganized itself around him when he entered, and she'd simply fallen. The way women in movies fall, cleanly, completely, with perfect lighting. That was not what happened. What happened was that Roman spilled red wine on her coat at a charity auction. A coat she'd saved 3 paychecks to buy, and then tried to fix it by handing her cash without making eye contact, the way powerful men often do when they've inconvenienced someone they don't consider worth embarrassing themselves over. She handed it back. He finally looked at her. "I don't want your money," she said. "I want you to say you're sorry." Nobody in that room said anything. A few people stopped breathing. One woman near the bar actually turned around to see who had just spoken to Roman Voss like that. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, and she would think about this later, replaying it the way you replay the moment, before something important, he laughed. Not the performative laugh of a man trying to recover his dignity. A real one, surprised and a little helpless. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you," she said, and she walked away. He sent someone to find her 20 minutes later. That was 3.5 years before the night Selena moved her place card. And Nia would be lying if she said the years between those 2 moments had been nothing but difficulty. They hadn't been. Roman was complicated, private, and occasionally maddening, but he loved her in a way that was not quiet or decorative. It was the kind of love that had weight, that took up space. He called her from cities she couldn't locate on a map, just to tell her he'd seen something that reminded him of her. He remembered small things, the way she took her coffee, the particular author she'd been meaning to read, the anniversary of her mother's death, which Nia herself sometimes forgot until the morning arrived and something in her chest went wrong. He remembered everything she had ever told him. He also came home with blood on his shirt twice, refused to explain where he'd been on certain nights, and kept a silence around the professional parts of his life that Nia had learned, early on, not to press too hard against. She was not naive about what Roman Voss did. She had not married an illusion, but she had not married his family either. And that distinction, the one she had believed would be manageable, turned out to be the hairline fracture that ran quietly through everything. Selena Voss was not, on the surface, a violent woman. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make scenes. In public, in front of Roman, she behaved toward Nia with the specific warmth of a person performing warmth, the hand on the arm, the smile that arrived exactly half a second late, the compliments that managed, somehow, to contain a small wound inside every syllable. "You look so lovely tonight, Nia. That color is very brave on you." Brave. As if wearing a deep plum dress required courage. As if Nia's choices were always slightly too much, slightly off, slightly in need of generous translation. Nia noticed. Of course she noticed. But Roman was standing 3 feet away, and the comment existed in that precise space between insulting and deniable, the space Selena operated in like a woman who had spent decades perfecting the architecture of it. Marcus was less subtle. Roman's uncle had the bluntness of a man who believed wealth made rudeness a personality trait rather than a character flaw. He made comments about Nia's background, where she'd grown up, what her family did, whether she'd gone to the right schools, in the tone of someone asking innocent questions when they were, in fact, making a series of statements. Adrian, Roman's cousin, mostly watched. He was the kind of person who didn't create cruelty himself, but enjoyed it when others did the work, nodding along with a slight smile, refilling his glass. None of this happened in front of Roman. That was the point. That was the entire architecture of it. The first incident Nia would later identify as the one that should have told her how serious it was. Not a snide comment, not a plausibly deniable remark, but an actual act happened at Easter. Roman had been pulled away by a phone call before dinner was served. He stepped outside, and the door had barely closed behind him before the temperature in the room shifted. It was subtle, just a degree or two, the kind of shift you feel in your body before you can name it. Selena was the one who moved the place card. Nia had watched her do it, with the focused calm of a woman performing a ritual she'd rehearsed, lifting Nia's card from beside Roman's seat at the head of the table and relocating it, unhurried, to the far end. Near the kitchen, near the door that the servers used. "The table has been rearranged," Selena said, to no one in particular. For flow, no one said anything. 14 people at that table. 14 people who watched it happen and found something else to look at. Nia stood very still for a moment. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was faster than she would have liked. She was aware of her hands, which she made herself keep relaxed at her sides, instead of pressing together the way she wanted to. She walked to the far end of the table. She sat down. She picked up her napkin and placed it across her lap and smiled at the server who came to fill her water glass, because the server was the only person in that room who hadn't just participated in something ugly. When Roman came back inside and found her at the wrong end of the table, she told him the seating had been rearranged last minute. She watched him accept this, watched him look faintly puzzled for a moment before someone pulled him into a conversation, and she thought, I could tell him right now. I could tell him exactly what happened. She didn't. Because she understood Roman Voss well enough to know what telling him would cost. Not her him. The man loved his mother with the loyalty of someone who had watched her hold a family together through grief and danger, who had grown up understanding that Selena Voss was the foundation that didn't crack. Telling him would force a rupture in that, and she wasn't certain, sitting at the wrong end of that table, with her heart still beating faster than normal, that she was willing to be the one who caused it. Not yet. She told herself not yet. But not yet has a way of becoming not ever when the incidents keep arriving, and the reasons for silence keep feeling reasonable. The next gathering, she was excluded from the family photograph. Not dramatically. There was no moment where someone told her to step aside. It simply happened the way things happen in groups, when everyone has silently agreed to a version of events. The photographer organized the shot, family members arranged themselves, and somehow Nia ended up standing just outside the frame. An afterthought. A woman holding her own clutch at the edge of the lawn, while the camera captured a family she had legally joined 3 years ago. Roman had been handed a phone call just before the photo. He came back to find it finished. I missed it, he said. It was quick, Nia said. She smiled. She was beginning to understand how much work a smile could do, how it could cover a multitude of things she wasn't ready to say. At the charity gala 3 months later, Selena introduced her to the mayor's wife. And this is Nia, Selena said, Roman's companion. Not his wife, companion. As if 3 years of marriage, a legal ceremony, a ring on her finger, were merely an extended arrangement, something temporary and pleasant that hadn't yet reached its natural conclusion. The mayor's wife had glanced at Nia's left hand, where the ring was clearly visible, and something in her expression flickered there and gone. Whether it was sympathy or discomfort or simple confusion, Nia couldn't tell. She didn't have time to figure it out because she was too busy keeping her face arranged in an expression that communicated absolutely. Nothing was wrong. Lovely to meet you, Nia said. Later that night, in the car home, Roman had fallen asleep against the window. He always fell asleep in moving vehicles, a habit she'd found endearing in the beginning and now sometimes found lonely, and Nia sat beside him in the dark and looked at her ring. She thought about calling her sister, and she didn't. She thought about writing it down somewhere, all of it, the accumulated record of small acts that together formed something much larger. Then she didn't do that either. She just sat in the dark car and listened to Roman breathe and told herself he loves you. That's real. The rest of it, you can handle the rest of it. She had grown up being told she was strong. It was the compliment given most often to black women who were in fact just exhausted, just absorbing more than anyone was supposed to absorb, without acknowledging the weight. She knew the difference between strength and silence. She knew she was currently doing one while calling it the other. She did it anyway. The servants were the quiet detail that nobody mentioned, but everyone noticed. It was beneath obvious the kind of thing that if you described it out loud, someone could reasonably say you were imagining patterns. But Nia was not someone who imagined patterns. She noticed them. She was served last. Always. Even when she was seated before others, the servers' circuits around the table arranged themselves so that she received her food after everyone else at her end of the table, then after some people at the other end, then eventually her plate arrived. Not dramatically late, just late enough to notice. Late enough for it to be something. She caught one of the younger servers, a girl, no more than 20, with anxious eyes watching her nervously as she set the plate down. The girl looked away immediately, and Nia understood then that this wasn't the staff choosing to do this. This was an instruction they'd been given. They looked uncomfortable, because they were doing something they probably found distasteful. She wanted to tell the girl, "It's okay. You didn't decide anything." She wanted to say, "I know it wasn't you." She said nothing. She picked up her fork. Marcus's comment came on a Tuesday evening in October, at a smaller dinner, only 7 or 8 people, when Roman had excused himself to take a business call, and the conversation had drifted toward family matters, marriages, futures. Of course, Marcus said, in the voice he used when he was pretending to make an observation rather than a statement, Roman's situation isn't permanent. Men in his position, they go through phases. Phases. The word sat in the room. Nia looked at him across the table. He was refilling his wine, not even fully meeting her eyes, because he didn't need to. The comment had been made. It was out in the world now. Phases, she repeated, her voice neutral. I only mean, Marcus said, with the ease of a man who had never once been held accountable for a thing he'd said, that Roman is still figuring out what he wants. Long term. She nodded slowly, as if she were giving genuine consideration to the idea that her own marriage was a phase her husband was going through. Interesting, she said. And then she turned to the woman beside her and asked about her garden renovation, because the only way to deny someone like Marcus the thing they were looking for was to refuse to give it to them. But that night, after Roman had come home and fallen asleep, Nia lay beside him, staring at the ceiling for 2 hours. He loves you, she told herself again. And then, for the first time, but how long can you keep doing this? She couldn't have known then that Selena was already planning the anniversary banquet. Couldn't have known that what had been a series of quiet cruelties deniable, dispersed, insulated from consequence, was about to become something orchestrated and public, designed not merely to demean her, but to erase her in front of every person who mattered in their world. She couldn't have known that Roman's meeting was going to end 4 hours early. She couldn't have known that the night Selena had spent months engineering would become the night. Everything she'd built so carefully, the silence, the smiles, the strategic restraint, would finally break open, not because Nia shattered, but because someone walked through a door at exactly the wrong moment. Or maybe she would think later, exactly the right one. What she knew, lying in the dark beside the man she had chosen and kept choosing, was that she was tired. Not of him. Never of him. But tired in the way you get tired when you've been carrying something heavy for too long and your hands have stopped shaking, only because they've gone numb. Turned her head and looked at Roman's face in the dark. The lines of it that she'd memorized. The particular way he breathed when he was deep in sleep, slower than you'd expect for a man who moved through his waking hours, like someone perpetually braced for impact. She reached over, didn't touch him, just hovered her hand an inch above his shoulder, close enough to feel the warmth of him. Then she drew her hand back and turned to face the ceiling again. She didn't cry. She'd already decided, a long time ago, that she wouldn't cry where he might see. Not because she was ashamed of it, because she didn't want him to ask her why, and she didn't trust herself, in that particular state, to lie convincingly. She had protected him from this for a year and a half. She told herself she could keep going. She was wrong. But she didn't know that yet, and so she closed her eyes, and eventually, slowly, unevenly, she slept. The banquet was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks was enough time for Nia to almost convince herself she was fine. That was the dangerous thing about almost. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It was more like a door you propped open, just enough to keep believing. Air was still getting through, even when the room was slowly running out of it. She went through the motions of her life, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to function around a bruise. She had her work. She ran a small nonprofit focused on arts education in underfunded schools, the kind of work that required her to be present and sharp and genuinely herself, which was probably the only reason she hadn't completely disappeared inside the performance of being fine. At work, nobody looked at her the way the Voss family looked at her. Nobody measured the distance between where she was sitting and where she was supposed to be. At work, she was just Naya, and Naya was, by most observable measures, very good at what she did. But she'd started waking up earlier than usual. Not intentionally. Simply stopped sleeping past 5, pulling her out of whatever dream she was in and depositing her at the surface of consciousness with her heart already moving too fast for that hour of the morning. She'd lie there beside Roman, listening to the specific silence of a house that belonged to a man like him, the low hum of security systems, the distant sound of someone on the overnight staff walking a perimeter, and she would run through things in her head. Place card, the photograph, companion, fizzes. She was cataloging. She hadn't decided yet what she was cataloging it for. She told herself it was just the way her brain worked, that she'd always been an organizer of information, that this was simply her mind doing what it did. But somewhere underneath that, in a place she hadn't fully looked yet, she knew she was building a case. Against what? She wasn't ready to say. Roman noticed she was waking up early. Of course he did. The man slept like a person waiting for something, which meant he was sensitive to any change in the room around him, a shift in weight, a change in breathing, a body that was no longer relaxed beside him. "You're not sleeping," he said, one morning. Not a question. He said it the way he said most things he was certain of, with a flatness that wasn't unkind, just direct. "I'm sleeping," she said, "just waking up a little earlier than usual." He looked at her. Roman had a particular way of looking at people that had nothing theatrical about it, no raised brow, no dramatic pause. He simply looked, with a quality of attention that made you feel genuinely seen, which could be warm or unsettling, depending on what you were trying to hide. "Is something bothering you?" he asked. "Work stuff," she said. "The grant application for the Meridian program. I've been running the numbers in my head." He accepted this. He was not, by nature, a man who pushed past the answer he was given if the answer seemed plausible. That was one of the things she had always appreciated about him. He didn't interrogate her. He trusted her to tell him what he needed to know. She was currently using that trust against both of them. "Come here," he said, and pulled her back against his chest in the particular way he had, of doing it not gentle exactly, more deliberate, like he was making a decision, and she lay there listening to his heartbeat, and thought, "Tell him." She thought it for about 40 seconds. Then she thought about Selena's face. The way Selena looked at Roman when he walked into a room, the particular exhausted devotion of a woman who had held everything together through years of danger and loss, who looked at her son like he was the thing she'd built her entire life around surviving long enough to see. She thought about what it would do to Roman to have to choose. She closed her eyes. She said nothing. The banquet invitation arrived on a Thursday, printed on cream cardstock, the way all Voss family events were announced, formal, unhurried, as if the decision of whether to attend had already been made for you. Roman's 50th first cousin's wedding anniversary. A celebration, the whole family. Roman held it out to her over breakfast, with the mild expression of a man presenting a mildly unwelcome obligation. 3 weeks, he said. I know, she said. We don't have to stay the whole night. She looked up from the card. It's fine, Nia. Roman, it's fine. They're your family. He studied her for a moment, and she could feel him deciding something, whether to press, whether to let it go, whether to say the thing that had been sitting between them for months, unspoken, accumulating. She watched him make the decision in real time, watched the moment he chose to believe her. All right, he said. He went back to his coffee. She went back to the invitation. Her thumb was pressing into the edge of the cardstock, hard enough to leave a small indentation. She noticed this and made herself stop. 3 weeks. The thing about Selena Voss was that she was genuinely intelligent. That was the part people sometimes missed, assuming her cruelty was the result of pettiness or simple prejudice, as if malice required stupidity to function. It didn't. The most effective cruelties Nia had ever encountered had always come from people who were paying very close attention. Selena paid close attention. She knew exactly when Roman was likely to be pulled away. She had been managing the rhythms of his professional life, in some peripheral way, since before he was old enough to understand what his family did. She knew which calls came on Friday evenings. She knew which meetings ran long. She knew that a man like Roman, regardless of how much he loved his wife, was also a man who ran an operation that did not pause for family dinners, and that the right phone call at the right moment was essentially guaranteed. So when Nia walked into the banquet hall on the night of the anniversary celebration and saw the seating arrangement, she understood immediately that this had been planned. Not in the paranoid way, not in the way of a woman looking for evidence of something she'd already decided was true. In the plain, observable way, the way you understand a thing when you see it clearly enough. Her name was not beside Roman's. His former fiance's was. Alana Vasquez, dark-haired, composed, wearing a wine-colored dress that managed to only look effortless in the way that things only look effortless when enormous effort has gone into them. She was already seated when Nia arrived, already in conversation with the woman to her left, and she looked up when Nia walked in with the brief, calibrated glance of someone who had been told where to sit and had decided not to feel complicated about it. Nia stood at the edge of the room for exactly 3 seconds. She found her name. She was near the servants' entrance. Not close to it. Not in that general area. Near it, in the way that communicated something specific and deliberate, the way you put something near a door when you want to remind it that the door exists. She became aware in that moment of approximately 12 people in the room who were watching her. Not obviously. The Voss family had never been obvious about anything. But she felt the weight of the attention, the collective waiting, and she understood that this had been arranged partly for her and partly for an audience. This was a performance. She was the subject of it. She was still standing near the entrance when Marcus materialized beside her. He had a drink already, which meant he'd arrived early enough to need one, which meant he'd been here when the seating was set up, which meant he knew. Nia, he said warmly, in the voice he used in front of people. You look well, Marcus, she said. Roman not with you yet? He's parking. He wasn't parking. He was on a call in the car. She'd kissed him on the cheek and told him to take his time. She'd find their seats. She'd said it easily, naturally, because she'd gotten very good at saying things easily and naturally. Of course, Marcus said. And then, in a lower register, as if they were sharing a confidence, quite a gathering tonight. The whole family. You know how Selena loves these things. Bringing everyone together. He paused, in the specific way of a man who pauses, because he has something to add and wants you to notice the addition. Everyone who belongs, naturally. Nia turned her head and looked at him. He was smiling. It was the smile of someone who had been getting away with things for so long that the concept of consequence had become essentially theoretical. Naturally, she said, and she walked away from him. She found her seat. She sat in it. She placed her clutch on the table beside the water glass, and she looked at the room with the same expression she brought to every difficult thing, calm, surface level, giving away nothing. And she began the internal calculation she always did at these events, which was essentially, how long until Roman is in this room? And can I get through until then? The answer was usually yes. Tonight something felt different. She couldn't have named it precisely. It was in the quality of the attention, not the usual sideways glances of people who found her presence mildly uncomfortable. This was something more focused, more expectant. People were waiting for something to happen. The server bypassed her first. She noticed and said nothing. The server came around again, distributing bread, and bypassed her again, not completely, leaving one roll at the edge of her plate almost as an afterthought before moving immediately onward. Naya looked down at the single roll and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, they gave that server specific instructions tonight. More specific than usual. She looked up and found one of the younger Voss cousins, a girl named Petra, maybe 24, who had always been quiet at these events without being particularly cruel, looking at her with an expression that was almost apologetic. Almost. Petra looked away the moment their eyes met. Even the people who felt bad about it weren't going to do anything. Selina arrived late to her own event, which was itself a statement, the kind of entrance that communicated this entire thing exists, because I chose to create it. She wore deep charcoal silk, her hair swept up with the precision of a woman who had never once dressed carelessly in her adult life. She moved through the room, accepting greetings with a hand extended and a smile distributed like measured portions, and she did not look at Nia when she entered. That was also a statement, the deliberate not looking. Nia had come to understand that Selina's silences and absences were as purposeful as everything else about her. Not looking at someone in a room you controlled was a way of confirming what they were, not worth the acknowledgement. Nigel watched her cross the room and embrace Ilana Vasquez with the specific warmth of a woman greeting someone she genuinely approved of. It lasted 4 seconds, she counted. She had started counting things like that. Durations, distances, the measurable evidence of what was being communicated without words. Then Selina moved to the head of the table area. She looked around the room with the expression of a woman, surveying something she'd built, something she was satisfied with. And for just a fraction of a second, barely anything, a flicker her gaze landed on Nia. Not on Nia's face, on Nia's seat, and the corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, exactly. Something smaller, something private. The expression of a person who has set something in motion and is checking to confirm it has landed where she intended. Then she moved on. Nia picked up her water glass and drank from it slowly, and set it back down with a precision that was the only outlet she permitted herself. Roman texted at 7:42, running about 90 minutes. Keller won't stop talking. Save me something good. She looked at the message. She typed, "Take your time." Everything's fine here. She stared at those 4 words. Everything's fine here. She sent them. She put the phone in her clutch. The meal began. The courses came out, and Naya's continued to arrive late, not dramatically, just late enough, just consistently enough. She ate what was put in front of her and participated in the conversation nearest to her, which was a discussion about a renovation one of the Voss in-laws was undertaking, and she contributed reasonable things to it, and she kept her back straight and her face open, and she was fine. She was completely fine. Then Selina stood. The room settled almost immediately, that particular kind of quiet that falls when someone commands it without having to ask. Selina held her wine glass loosely, not raised yet, just held, and she looked around the table with the expression of a woman who had been the center of gravity in rooms like this for 30 years. Family, she said. Simple. The word sitting by itself for a moment. Then she talked about legacy, about what the Voss name meant, had always meant not the money or the reputation, she said, but the understanding that blood carried something. That who you chose, who you brought into the circle, determined the shape of everything that came after. She said it gracefully. It was always graceful, about the things she meant most viciously. Nia sat very still. She was about 12 feet from where Selena was standing. She could see her profile, the deliberate angle of her chin, the way she paused before the sentences she wanted to land. "We protect what we've built," Selena said. "We protect it from things that don't belong inside it. That's not cruelty. That's simply knowing what you are." The table was quiet. Nia was aware of her own breathing. It was slower than it should have been, which was what happened when she was actively controlling it. Nobody looked at her directly. Nobody looked away from her completely. That particular social positioning where you become simultaneously invisible and the center of everything was something she had experience with, but not like this. Not this deliberate, not this sustained, not in a room this large. She put her hands in her lap under the table and pressed them flat against her thighs and looked at a fixed point on the opposite wall. Selena finished speaking. People raised their glasses. Toast was drunk. Conversation resumed. Nia did not raise her glass. Nobody noticed. Or if they noticed, nobody said anything, which amounted to the same thing. It was Adrian who finally crossed the line that couldn't be walked back. He had moved to the seat beside her sometime, during the third course, an empty chair, person who'd been assigned there, having drifted to another part of the table, and he sat down with the loose-limbed ease of someone who was several drinks into the evening and had decided to enjoy himself. "You're handling this well," he said quietly, in her direction. She turned her head slowly. "What? All of this?" He gestured vaguely at the room. "The whole thing. You handle it well." He said it the way you'd compliment a horse on its temperament, with a detached appreciation that had nothing human at its center. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said. "Sure you are." He smiled. He had his father's ease, Marcus's comfort in his own immunity. "Look, I'm not the enemy here. I'm just saying you're aware of the situation. You've always been aware, and you've been very patient." He paused. "But patient has a limit, doesn't it?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Adrian," she said, "I think you should go back to your seat. I'm just making conversation." "You're not. Go back to your seat." Something shifted behind his eyes, a brief recalibration, the look of a man who had expected a different response and was adjusting. The smile didn't disappear. It just changed shape slightly. "You know," he said, "the interesting thing about Roman is that he's always believed the people around him are more loyal than they are. It's almost sweet." He tilted his glass slightly, watching the liquid move. "He'll figure it out eventually. They always do." Nia said nothing. "The question is just how long it takes," Adrian continued. "And what gets broken in the meantime." She turned away from him. She picked up her fork. She put food in her mouth and chewed it and swallowed it, and did not allow any part of her face to respond to what had just happened, because she understood, with complete clarity, that every person within earshot had just heard that exchange, and that some of them had been meant to. This was not cruelty anymore. This was something organized. She excused herself to the restroom at 9:15. She walked through the room with the measured pace of someone who wasn't leaving, just stepping out briefly, and she pushed through the door into the corridor, and then into the restroom, which was empty, and she stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like herself. That was the strange thing. She'd expected to see something different, some visible sign of the accumulated weight of the evening. But she looked like Nia Holloway Voss, composed, clear-eyed, in a green dress she'd chosen because Roman had once said she looked extraordinary in green. She let out a breath, then another. She thought, I could call him right now. Right now, from this bathroom, I could call Roman and tell him to come in. I could describe this room and this evening, and the seating, and what Adrian just said. I could end this tonight. Her phone was in her clutch. His number was the first in her contacts. She stood there for 90 seconds, which felt much longer. Then she put the phone back and turned off the water. She was not ready. She still believed, and this was the belief that would cost her, that she could manage this. That there was still a version of this story, where nobody had to get hurt, where she could hold the line long enough to find a different solution, some path through that didn't require Roman to look at his mother and choose. She still believed she could protect everyone. She went back out. She was 3 steps back into the corridor when she heard it. Selena's voice, coming from the antechamber off the main hall, a smaller room, used for pre-dinner cocktails, now presumably empty. The door was not fully closed. Sound carried. She's been sitting at that table all evening like she belongs there. Selena's voice had its normal pitch, its controlled cadence. This was not a woman losing her composure. This was a woman speaking plainly in a room she believed was private. Another voice, female, older. An aunt, Nia thought. Renata. She stays very quiet. That's what she does, Selena said. She absorbs it. She thinks if she just endures enough, eventually we'll accept her. She doesn't understand that endurance isn't the same as belonging. Nia stopped walking. She was 6 feet from the door. Corridor was empty. There was no reason, technically, to keep standing there. Every reasonable instinct said, keep walking. Go back to the table. Don't give yourself more to carry. She stayed. Roman won't, Renata began. Roman sees what he wants to see, Selena said. He always has. He chose her because she challenged him. He was bored and she was unexpected, and he mistook that for something lasting, a pause. The sound of a glass being set down. It won't last. And if it does, it won't. Flat. Final. Whatever she gives him, she can't give him everything. And when he finally understands that when he looks at what comes after, children, legacy, the family he's building, he'll make a different decision. Men like Roman always do. Nia's hand was pressed against the wall. She didn't remember putting it there. You're very certain, Renata said quietly. I'm his mother, Selena said. I'm always certain about my son. Nia stood in that corridor for another 4 seconds. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. She could feel the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from the moment you understand that something you've been managing has been much larger than you allowed yourself to see. She had thought she was handling it. She had thought her silence was a choice she was making. She had believed, on some level, that Selena's behavior, the remarks, the seating, the small daily acts of erasure was the boundary of it, the full extent. She understood now, in the chill of that corridor, that she had been wrong. This wasn't ambient cruelty. This was a campaign. Patient, organized, conducted by a woman who was running it the way experienced people run long operations slowly, without visible seams, with the absolute confidence of someone who had never once encountered an outcome she couldn't engineer. And Nia had been letting it happen. She had been so committed to not forcing Roman to choose that she had handed Selena 2 years of uncontested ground. She straightened up. She took her hand off the wall. She stood for 1 more second in the empty corridor, alone, clear-headed, with the specific quiet of someone who has just made a decision they can't take back. She was going back into that room. She was going to sit at that table. She was going to make it through the rest of this evening without Roman knowing what she'd just heard, because she needed time to think about what came next. She needed to decide finally, with no more delay, what she was actually going to do. She turned, and at the far end of the corridor, the main entrance to the hall was open. And through it, moving with the unhurried, familiar gait of a man walking into a room that belonged to him, was Roman Voss. He hadn't texted. He was 4 hours early. He stopped when he saw her. His expression did that thing it did when he was reading a situation, not shocked, not confused, but processing fast and completely, the way he processed everything. He looked at her face, whatever she was, showing him whatever she'd failed to put away in the single second between him and being seen was enough. Nia, he said, and for one terrible moment she genuinely did not know what was going to come out of her mouth. The corridor felt smaller than it was. That was the first thing Nia registered, the strange compression of the space, the way Roman's presence at one end of it seemed to reduce the available air. She had seen him walk into rooms 100 times. She knew the particular gravity of it. But she had never been standing in a hallway with 2 years of unsaid things between them when it happened, and the difference was significant. He was still in his coat. He hadn't stopped at the entrance to hand it off the way he normally would, which meant he'd moved fast, which meant something had shifted in his timeline, and he had come straight here, straight to this room, without the usual buffer of arrival. Nia, he said again. She made a decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Not a conscious, deliberated decision. She didn't have time for that. It was the decision her body made before her mind could review it. She crossed the corridor and she went to him. Not running. Walking at normal speed, with her face arranged in something that was meant to be relief at seeing him early. She was close enough to touch him before she trusted herself to speak. "You're done already," she said. Keller had a situation. We cut it short. He was looking at her face, still doing the reading thing, still processing. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I'm glad you're here. Your hands are cold." She hadn't noticed. She looked down at her hands as if they belonged to someone else, which was how they felt, slightly disconnected, operating on their own instructions. She curled them against her sides. "It's cold in the corridor," she said. He didn't move for a moment. He was wearing the expression he wore when he knew something was being managed and was deciding whether to let it be managed or not, a stillness behind his eyes that most people mistook for patience, but was actually something closer to strategy. Then he took her right hand in both of his. His hands were warm. She felt it run all the way up her arm, that warmth, like her body had been waiting for it. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's go in." The room registered his arrival before he reached the door. That was always how it was with Roman. The people who faced the entrance saw him first, and the information traveled through the room like a current head by head in a ripple that moved too fast to be described as gradual and too subtle to be described as obvious. Within 4 seconds of Roman stepping through the doors of the banquet hall, every person at that table knew he was there. Nia felt the shift. She was watching for it. Selena turned from her conversation with the woman beside her, and her face moved through 3 things very quickly: surprise, pleasure, and then brief enough that only someone watching carefully would catch it, something else. Kind of recalibration. The expression of a person who has been running one version of an evening and has just been informed that version is no longer operational. It was there for less than a second. Then Selena was already smiling, already moving, already becoming the woman who loved her son and was delighted to see him early. Roman, she reached him near the edge of the room, before he'd fully made his way to the table. She took his face in both hands, the way she always did, the maternal gesture that communicated possession and tenderness in equal parts. "We didn't expect you. Wrapped up sooner than planned," he said. He was looking past her at the table, at the seating arrangement, at the specific geography of who was sitting where. Nia watched him take it in, watched his eyes move from the chair that was his where Ilana Vasquez was seated, now looking up with the careful expression of someone caught somewhere awkward to the far end of the table, where Nia's place card was still sitting near the servant's entrance. His face didn't change. That was almost worse than if it had. "Interesting arrangement," he said. His voice was completely normal. "Conversation register, no edge to it." "We had to adjust for flow," Selena said smoothly. She'd had years of practice explaining the inexplicable in reasonable terms. Last-minute changes to the guest list. Roman was still looking at the table. Then he looked at Nia beside him. Something moved through his expression, not anger yet, but the precursor to it, the quiet before a weather system arrives. "Find your place?" "I did," she said. He nodded once. Slowly, he looked at Selena, and Selena looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had, in 30 years of managing this person, never once encountered something she couldn't talk her way through. She had no reason to believe tonight would be different. She was wrong. Roman did not sit down immediately. He stood at the edge of the room with his coat, still, on nobody had offered to take it, or he'd waved the offer off. Nia wasn't sure which, and he spoke to several people, in the way he always did at family events. Working the room not aggressively, but with the thoroughness of someone who tracked things. Who wanted information? He spent 2 minutes with his cousin Dmitri near the bar. 4 minutes with an older relative, whose name Nia had never successfully retained. He stopped to speak with Ilana Vasquez, briefly, in the particular manner of a man managing an awkward situation with practice at neutrality, acknowledging her presence without creating anything from it. Ilana said something. Roman nodded. His expression remained perfectly even. Then he came back to Nia. Ready to sit? He asked. Of course. He took her hand, not loosely, fully, deliberately, the way he held her hand when he was making a point rather than simply holding it, and he walked her to the table. Not to her assigned seat, to his. He pulled out the chair beside his own, the chair that bore Alana's place card, which he simply picked up and moved aside with his free hand, without comment, without ceremony, and he seated Nia there. Then he sat beside her. The table was quiet. Not completely. Other conversations were still happening in other pockets of the room, but in the immediate vicinity, in the 8 or 10 seats nearest them, the sound dropped noticeably. People were watching their plates with the focused attention of individuals who were absolutely listening. Selinapsa was watching from 3 seats down. Nia could feel it. Roman didn't look at her. He picked up the menu card and appeared to review it. "What have I missed?" he asked Nia conversationally. "The first 2 courses," she said. "The soup was good." "You always say that." "It's usually true." He set the menu down. He reached over and took her hand under the table and held it there, loosely, just held it. She could feel his thumb moving slightly over her knuckles, a small, unconscious thing, the movement of a man who needed to be doing something with his hands while he thought. He was thinking. She knew the quality of his stillness when he was thinking. The evening continued, but something had changed in the room, and everyone could feel it. The particular energy of an evening that had been running on a specific frequency, Cecina's frequency, CC, organized and intentional, had been interrupted, and the people who had been participants in that frequency were now recalibrating. Marcus was quieter. Adrian had moved back to his original seat and was paying close attention to his food. Even Renata, who had been animated throughout the early part of the evening, was subdued. And Sia was aware of all of it. She tracked it the way she had learned to track things at these gatherings, with the peripheral awareness of someone who had spent years needing to know where the next thing was coming from. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Roman had not come into that banquet hall through the main entrance. She found this out later. At the time, she only knew that something in his manner over the 3rd course, over the 4th, through the dessert service, had an extra layer of stillness in it. Quality beyond his usual thinking stillness. Something that was more like a person who has received information and is deciding what to do with it. She thought it was the seating, the visible, undeniable evidence of the seating arrangement, which he'd clocked immediately and which she'd watched him file away. She didn't know about the door. The door was the thing. There was a secondary entrance to the banquet hall, a corridor off the east wing, used mostly by staff. Roman knew the house the way he knew all spaces that mattered to his family, completely, including the parts that weren't meant for guests. He'd grown up in rooms like this one, had learned their bones as a child. He had come in through the east corridor. He had been standing in the doorway partially, not entering, watching the room from an angle that lets him see without being seen for approximately 4 minutes before Nia had excused herself to the restroom. In those 4 minutes, he had watched his mother give a toast about legacy and belonging and protecting what was built from things that didn't belong inside it. He had watched Naya sit through it without moving. He had watched her face the careful blankness of it, the control, and understood, in the way that you understand things you've been, not quite allowing yourself to understand for a long time, that this was not the first time. He had watched Adrian move to the seat beside her. He hadn't been close enough to hear every word of that exchange. But he'd heard enough, the tone of it, the body language of a man who was comfortable saying things he expected to go unchallenged. And he had watched Nia turn away from Adrian. He had watched her pick up her fork. He had watched her eat what was on her plate with the specific, deliberate composure of a person who has decided that giving nothing away is the only form of power available to them. He'd stood in that doorway for 4 minutes, and he had felt something move through him that he did not have a clean name for. It wasn't anger. Exactly, anger was something he knew well, could identify quickly, could manage. This was older than anger, heavier. The feeling of a man looking at something that has been happening in his house, to his wife, while he stood 20 feet outside the door and called it unavoidable. He had gone to the main entrance and come properly, because whatever came next required him to be in the room. And whatever came next, he had already decided was going to be his. Naya found out about the door at 11:17 that night. They were home by then. The banquet had ended with the surface decorum that Voss family events always maintained, regardless of what moved underneath them. Roman had thanked the host, spoken to Selena briefly at the end of the evening with the kind of neutrality that might have been forgiveness, or might have been something much colder, and he had driven Nia home himself, which he sometimes did and sometimes didn't, depending on the logistics of the evening. He was quiet in the car. She let him be quiet. She was running her own internal inventory, cataloging the night, organizing the hours of it, trying to decide what came next. When they got home, he poured them both water, not drinks, which told her something. He brought hers to the living room and set it on the table in front of the couch, where she'd sat down, and then he sat across from her, not beside her, which told her something else. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I came in through the east corridor," he said. Everything in her went very still. "The staff entrance," she said. "I know the house." He paused. "I was watching the room for a few minutes before I came in." She didn't say anything. She was running calculations. How much had he seen from that angle? What was visible from the east doorway? What did he know? And her face was doing the thing it did under pressure, which was very close to nothing. "I saw the toast," he said. "I saw most of the room. I saw Adrian." He stopped. He picked up his water glass, looked at it, set it back down. How long? The question was quiet. Not hard, not loud. Just precise. She looked at him for a long moment. The years of managed silence had their own momentum, their own gravity. She could feel it pulling at her. The familiar instinct to find a phrase that would navigate towards safety, something true but partial, something that would distribute the weight without creating an explosion. She opened her mouth. "Nia." His voice was still quiet. "Don't." She closed her mouth. She looked at her hands. 2 years, she said, a little more. The room was silent. He breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth. A single controlled breath that told her he was doing the same thing she was always doing, managing himself, keeping the surface from showing what was happening beneath it. 2 years, he repeated. "Yes, and you didn't tell me." "No." Another silence. Longer. "Why? Not why did you hide it? Not why didn't you trust me? Just why?" The single, stripped-down version of the question. She had thought about how she would answer this question if she ever had to. In the theoretical version of this conversation she'd been having with herself for 2 years. She'd had answers prepared. Reasonable answers. Caring answers. Answers that explained her reasoning in a way that was defensible and compassionate. All of those answers were gone. "Because I didn't want you to have to choose," she said. And her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Because I know what she is to you. And I knew if I told you, you'd have to decide between me and her, and I didn't want to be the reason for that. I thought I could handle it. I thought if I was patient enough, if I just held the line long enough, it would get better, or it wouldn't matter, or I would find some other way." She stopped. She looked up at him. I was wrong. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a word for. She had cataloged most of Roman's expressions. Over 3 years had a vocabulary for them, could read the difference between the ones that looked the same on the surface. This one was new. Or rather, it was a combination she hadn't seen before. Something that was grief and fury and tenderness, and something that looked almost like guilt, all of them present simultaneously, none of them dominating. "You were protecting me," he said. "I was trying to from my own family, from having to hurt your own family. There's a difference." He stood up. He didn't go anywhere, just stood, moved to the window, just stood there with his back to her. She watched his shoulders. She could read his body the way she could read his face. And what she read now was a man dealing with something that hadn't fully resolved into a single emotion yet. It was still in the middle, still moving. "I need you to tell me everything," he said to the window. "From the beginning, all of it." She took a slow breath. "That'll take a while," she said. "I know." And then he came back to the couch. He sat beside her this time, not across from her. He turned toward her. He waited. So she told him. She had not anticipated what it would feel like to actually say it. She had lived inside it for so long had carried the weight of it through every dinner, every gathering, every night of lying awake in the dark that she thought she knew its dimensions. She thought she'd quantified it. She hadn't. Saying it out loud was different. Putting each incident into words, sequencing them, watching Roman's face move through things as she spoke, that was different from living it alone in the interior of herself. It was larger in the room than it had been in her head. Or maybe it had always been that large, and she just hadn't let herself know it. She told him about Easter first, the place card. She watched something move across his jaw. She told him about the photograph. He went very still. She told him about Elana's introduction, about Companion. She saw his eyes change. She told him about the servant's instructions, the deliberate lateness of her service at every gathering. She told him about Marcus's comment about phases. She watched Roman's expression do something contained and dangerous, like a temperature dropping inside a closed room. She told him about Adrian that evening, the exact words, as close as she could reproduce them. And then she told him about the corridor. She told him what she'd heard through the door, Selena's voice, the words that had no performance in them because Selena hadn't known she was being heard. She told him about legacy, about belonging, about the prediction, delivered with the certainty of a woman who had never once doubted her own authority over outcomes it won't last. Men like Roman always do. She said these things clearly. She didn't soften them. And she watched Roman Voss, a man she had seen handle things that would have undone most people. A man whose composure was so practiced it sometimes felt architectural. She watched him sit very still and go somewhere behind his eyes that she had never seen before. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't move to reassure her. He just listened, with the focused, total quality of a man absorbing information he intends to act on, and when she finished, he sat in the silence for a moment. Then he said, "She called you a companion," in front of the mayor's wife. "And the photograph. I was standing just outside the frame." He nodded slowly, 3 times, the nod of a person processing, rather than responding. "The servants," he said. "That was her instruction." "I believe so." One of the younger servers looked uncomfortable enough that I think she'd been told something she didn't want to do. "Yes," Roman said quietly, as if this had confirmed something. "Yes, that tracks." She looked at him. "You sound like you're taking inventory." "I am." He looked at her directly. "I need to know all of it before I decide what to do. If I react before I have the full picture, I'll miss something. And I don't want to miss anything." A pause. "Not about this." She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. "Are you angry at me?" she asked. "For not telling you sooner?" He was quiet for a long time. "I'm angry at myself," he said finally. "For not seeing it. For not asking harder when you said nothing was wrong." He exhaled. "I let myself believe you because it was easier. Because I didn't want to look at it." His voice was level, but there was something rough at the edges of it. "That's on me, Roman. I should have known," he said. Not loudly, just firmly. "I know you. I know how you carry things. I've seen you cry when you thought I was asleep, Nia. I've seen you tense up every time we're going to a family event. I chose to believe what you told me instead of what I was seeing." He looked at her. "That was a choice I made, and I'm going to have to sit with that." She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. They sat together in the living room for a while, in the particular sense of 2 people who have moved through something and are standing on the other side of it, getting their bearings. He made calls the next morning. She didn't know the specifics. Roman operated in a space she had always respected as his, the professional mechanics of his life, the calls and meetings and arrangements that kept the Voss name running. She didn't ask, and he didn't explain, and that had always been their architecture. But she knew something was happening, because he was quieter than usual, not the thinking quiet, but the working quiet. Quiet of a man in motion. He came to find her at noon in her home office, where she was drafting a grant proposal with the specific focus of someone who needed to be thinking about something other than what she was thinking about. "I want you to know something," he said from the doorway. She turned. "Whatever I do next," he said, "it's not going to happen the way they expect it to. Nobody is going to see it coming from across a dinner table." He paused. but it is going to happen. She looked at him. Roman. What are you? There are things I've let go, he said. Out of loyalty. Things I've seen and chosen not to act on because they were family. His voice was very steady, very quiet. I'm going to stop choosing that. She put her pen down. What things? She said. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw in his face the careful weighing of someone deciding how much to show. Marcus, he said, has been running money through 3 of our legitimate holdings in ways that benefit him privately. I've known for about 8 months. He said it without inflection. I let it go. She stared at him. Adrian, he continued, has been undermining 2 of my associates' authority structures in ways that serve his own ambitions. I've known about that for 6 months, he paused. I let it go. Roman, I let it go, he said again, because they were blood. Because I thought I believed that blood meant they were ultimately on the right side of things. That whatever their flaws, the loyalty ran deeper. His jaw was tight. They were using me for that assumption. They've been using it for a long time. Stood up. And your mother, she said. My mother, he said, is going to have to understand something that I should have made clear a long time ago. He looked at Nia across the small room, her home office, with its evidence of her life, her work, the person she actually was independent of anyone's last name. And something crossed his face that she would think about for a long time afterward. It was the expression of a man arriving somewhere he should have arrived much sooner, and knowing it. She raised me to protect my family, he said. She just forgot that she's not the one who decides who that is anymore. The family meeting was not announced. That was intentional. Roman called them individually, separately, each call lasting no more than 90 seconds, and told them to come to the main house that evening. Not a request, not a gathering. Just come. Nia was in the kitchen when they arrived. She could hear them in the main hall, the sound of the family assembling, the murmur of people comparing notes, trying to read the temperature before it was explained to them. She heard Marcus. What's this about? She heard Adrian. He didn't say. She heard eventually the particular silence that fell when Roman walked into a room. She stayed in the kitchen. She had not been asked to come. She had not been told to stay out. The omission was something she understood to be intentional. Roman operated with precision, and the absence of an instruction was itself an instruction. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, cooling in the mug, and she listened to the sound of muffled voices through 2 closed doors, and she waited. She was still waiting when she heard Selena's voice rise above the others, not in volume, but in register. Pitch of a woman who has been told something she considers unacceptable and is moving toward the response she's always deployed successfully. Roman, this is not how we handle. I'm handling it. His voice, carrying even through the doors with the flatness she knew, was its most dangerous state. Not raised, not theatrical, just final. Another silence. Then Scylla said something Nia couldn't hear, and Roman said, clearly enough that it reached the kitchen, you moved her place card. The silence after that lasted long enough for Nia to set down her coffee cup very carefully on the table. She had not told him about the East Corridor, about hearing Selena through the door. She had told him what Selena said, yes, but not that Roman had entered through the East Corridor of the banquet hall before announcing his arrival, not that he had been positioned to hear something in addition to what she'd reported from the secondary room. The realization arrived now, quietly in the kitchen. He had heard more than she knew. He had been there longer than she knew. And whatever was happening in that room right now was built on a foundation she had only partially seen. She stood up from the table. She was half to the door when it opened. Selena was standing in the doorway. She looked for the first time in the 2.5 years Nia had known her like a woman who had walked into something she hadn't designed. The perfect arrangement of her expression was present but strained. Her posture was correct, but the quality of it had changed, the way a structure changes when something has shifted in its foundation. She looked at Nia. Nia looked at her. And Selena said, in a voice stripped down to something Nia had never heard from her, not warm, not weaponized, just plain. He heard everything. Not an explanation, not an apology, just a statement. Statement of a woman who is still processing the information that the room she thought she controlled had an open door she hadn't seen, and that the most important person in her life had been standing on the other side of it. "I know," Nia said. Selena's chin moved slightly, a fractional adjustment, the kind that happened when someone was working to maintain something that was cracking. "He heard all of it," she said. "The toast. What I said to Renata." She stopped. Her eyes moved over Nia's face, not with the cool assessment of someone seeking weakness, but with something that looked, for the first time, almost like recognition. Like she was seeing a person she had spent 2 years refusing to look at directly. Nia said nothing. "He was in the east corridor," Selena said. "Before he came in, he was watching." Her voice was still controlled, but barely. "For how long, Nia, did you know how long he was there?" "I didn't know he'd come in through the east corridor," Nia said. "I found out last night." Selena looked at her for a long, suspended moment. And then, from behind her, Roman's voice, from just inside the hall, "Mother." Selena turned. Roman was standing in the doorway of the main hall, and his face was the calmest Nia had ever seen it, which meant it was the most dangerous it had ever been. And he was looking at his mother with the expression of a man who has arrived, finally, at the decision he has been approaching for a long time. "Come back inside," he said. Selena straightened. She looked at Nia one more time, and in that look was something complicated. Something that was not yet remorse, but was perhaps the first moment of understanding that remorse would eventually be required. And then she turned and walked back through the door. Roman held Nia's gaze for exactly 1 second. In that second, everything. Then he followed his mother in, and the door closed, and Nisa stood alone in the kitchen, in the particular silence of a world that had just rearranged itself, and she understood that the version of her life she had been managing, the careful architecture of endurance she had built and maintained and defended for 2 years, was gone. What came next would not be something she could manage quietly. What came next was going to be loud and costly and real. And for the first time in 2 years, standing in her kitchen in the sudden quiet, Nia Holloway Voss did not try to prepare herself for it. She just stood there and breathed and let it be what it was. The door closed and the kitchen was quiet, and Nia stood in it for exactly as long as she could stand standing still, which turned out to be about 40 seconds. Then she sat back down. She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway, 'cause having something in her hands was better than not having something in her hands, and she listened to the sounds coming through the closed doors of the main hall with the focused attention of someone trying to read a situation through walls. She could hear Roman's voice but not his words. That was always how it was when he was being most deliberate. The volume dropped, not rose, and the lack of volume was its own kind of pressure. She could hear Marcus responding at one point, louder, the instinctive loudness of a man who defaults to volume when he's losing ground. She could hear nothing from Selena, which told her more than the others. Selena silent was Selena thinking. Selena thinking was Selena dangerous. And this was the thing Nia kept returning to. Sitting at her kitchen table with her cold coffee, the situation had changed. The geography of it had shifted in ways that Selena hadn't had time to fully map yet. For 2 years, Selena had operated in a space where she held the information asymmetry. She knew what she was doing. Nia knew what she was doing. Roman didn't know what either of them knew, and that gap, that specific gap, was the entire foundation of Selena's campaign. That gap was gone, and a woman like Selena Voss, standing in the rubble of a strategy she'd built across 2 years, was not going to be predictable. The door to the main hall opened at 8:43. Marcus came out first. He walked through the kitchen without looking at Nia, not the deliberate not looking he used as a weapon, but the not looking of a man who was genuinely focused on getting out of a room as fast as he could while maintaining enough dignity to pretend he was simply leaving at his own pace. His jaw was tight, his color was up. He had the look of someone who had been told things he could not argue with and could not dismiss, and was now recalibrating what his immediate future looked like. He left through the back entrance without a word. Adrian came out 3 minutes later. He looked younger than he usually did. Something had come off him, some of the polished ease that was his habitual camouflage. He saw Nia and stopped. actually stopped. For a full 2 seconds, with an expression that moved through several things too fast to read, and then landed somewhere that might have been shame or might have been simple exposure. The look of a person who has been named specifically and accurately, in a room they thought they controlled. He left without speaking either. Naya watched them go. She heard Selena's voice then, finally a single sentence, too low to parse, with a particular tightness in it that she'd never heard from the woman before. Then Roman's response, brief, 2 or 3 words, then silence. Then Roman came into the kitchen. He looked like himself. That was the first thing she checked. Not checked. Not injured, not disheveled, not wearing any of the adrenaline she could sometimes read off him after a difficult encounter. He looked like a man who had finished a meeting tired, slightly, in the eyes, but contained. He looked at her coffee cup. "That's cold," he said. "I know." He took the cup, poured it out, and refilled it from the carafe on the counter, without asking. He set it in front of her. Then he leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, not in the closed-off way, but in the thinking way, holding himself together while he organized what came next. "Marcus is out of the Ridgeway holdings," he said. "I'm moving his access by morning." She looked at him. He didn't argue, he tried. Roman's expression didn't change. "I had the documentation. He knew I had it." Once a man knows you're holding the specific thing he thought was buried, the argument becomes very short. And Adrian's situation is more complicated, but the authority reassignments are already drafted. He loses the East District relationships. He loses the Harmon contract oversight. He paused. He looked surprised. He thought watching was passive. He's learning it isn't. Nia wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup. "Your mother," she said. Roman was quiet for a moment. "My mother," he said, "is still in the main hall." "She didn't leave with them?" "I asked her to stay." He looked at Nia steadily. "I need you to come in there with me." Her hands tightened slightly on the cup. "Roman, I need you there," he said. "Not because you can't handle this on your own. Because this isn't something I'm doing separately from you. Not anymore." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that she recognized the sound of a man who has identified a mistake and is correcting it, deliberately, with the specific effort of correction, rather than just intention. "I should have been in this with you from the start. I wasn't. So I'm asking, will you come in?" She looked at him for a long moment. She set down the coffee cup. She stood up. "Let's go," she said. Selena was seated at the head of the long table in the main hall, which Nia recognized immediately as a choice the woman had chosen the seat that put the most table between herself and wherever anyone else would sit, and she had chosen the head of it because Selena Voss did not sit in chairs that implied anything other than authority, even in the immediate aftermath of having the ground pulled out from under her. She looked up when they came in. Her gaze moved to Nia and stayed there for exactly 1 second, the controlled assessment. The reflex of a woman who had spent decades reading rooms before moving to Roman. "Sit down," Roman said. It was not the way he said it to hotel staff or associates. It was the way he said it to family, which sounded almost identical, but carried a different weight entirely. He sat across from his mother. Nia sat beside him. The table between them and Selena was 6 feet of polished wood, and it felt like more. Selena's hands were on the table, folded. She was wearing the expression she wore when she was doing the thing she did best, organizing herself internally while presenting an external surface that gave nothing away. But there was something different about it tonight. Something had been disarranged. The expression was theirs, but it was sitting slightly wrong, like a painting that has been moved a fraction of an inch and hasn't been properly recentered. Roman said nothing for a moment. He let the silence sit. Selena was the one who broke it. "I would like to explain," she began. "You moved her place card," Roman said. She stopped. "Easter," he said. "You moved it to the servant's end of the table while I was outside. And then you told her the seating had been rearranged for flow." He said it with the quality of a man reading from a document, precise as evidential, not inflected with emotion. "That's where we're starting." Selena's chin lifted slightly. "Roman context is, we don't need context for that one," he said. "There's no context that changes what it was. Let's move on." He looked at her directly. The family photograph. She said nothing. The mayor's gala. Companion. He paused one beat. She's been my wife for 3 years. You introduced her as my companion. Selina's jaw was tight. I misspoke, she said. You did not misspeak. His voice didn't rise. It got quieter. You don't misspeak. You have never misspoken in your life. Every word you say is the word you meant to say. Something moved behind Selina's eyes. It might have been the first thing like recognition, the recognition of being seen completely by someone who learned from you, who inherited your precision, and can therefore not be fooled by the claim of imprecision. The servants, Roman said. You instructed them to serve her last. Selina exhaled short, controlled. Roman, I was managing. You were managing her, he said. Yes. I understand that now. A pause. The question I've been sitting with since last night is why. Because you are not a stupid woman. You know what I feel about Nia. You've known it for 3 years. And you did all of this anyway, which means you made a calculation. He leaned forward slightly. I want to know what the calculation was. The room was very quiet. Nia sat beside Roman without speaking. She was watching Selina the way she had watched her for 2 years, but it was different now, the watching. Before, it had been the watching of someone looking for incoming. This was different. This was the watching of someone who no longer needed to flinch. Selina looked at her son, and then slowly, deliberately, she looked at Nia. You want to know the calculation, Selina said. Her voice was still controlled, but the warmth was gone from it entirely. What remained was something older and more honest. The calculation was that she was not right for you. That a man in your position, with everything your father built, everything you've maintained, cannot afford a marriage that weakens the family's position. She doesn't weaken anything, Roman said. That is not how the people we deal with see it. Selina's voice was flat, direct. This was the truth, and she was choosing to tell it without softening it. Roman, the families we work with, the relationships we maintain, the city structures that allow us to operate, they have expectations. They always have. I was protecting. Don't say protecting. I was protecting, don't. His voice cracked across hers, not loudly, but with a sharpness that made Nia's breath catch. Do not use that word to describe what you did to her. Selina stopped. You humiliated her, Roman said. In this house. At my table. You humiliated my wife in front of a room full of people who looked to me, and you did it carefully enough that you thought I'd never find out, and you have been doing it for 2 years. He stopped. Breathed. Don't call that protection. The silence afterward was the kind that had weight. Selina sat very still. Her hands were still on the table, still folded, but the knuckles were different, not white, but changed. The effort of stillness made visible. I raised you, she said finally. Her voice was lower now, stripped of the strategic layer. After your father, I kept this family alive. I made the decisions nobody else was willing to make, and I held everything together, and I have been doing that for 30 years. She looked at him. I did not do those things so that you could build a life that undoes all of it. It doesn't undo anything. It puts everything at risk. Her voice was still controlled, but something had entered it, something that was almost the sound of genuine feeling, of a woman who believed what she was saying, even if the thing she believed had caused tremendous damage. Do you think the people we deal with don't notice? Do you think Harmon, Delaney, the Russo family, do you think they look at your marriage and see strength? They see a man who let sentiment override strategy. Then they misunderstand who I am, Roman said. Roman, if they think loving my wife is a weakness, he said, they are welcome to operate on that assumption. And then they will learn what happens to people who fundamentally misread me. He said it without heat, just as a factual statement about how things would go. That's the last time we're discussing whether my marriage is strategically appropriate. He paused. What we're discussing now is whether you understand what you did. Selina looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Nia. And Nia sat there and looked back. What you did to her, Roman said, was systematic. It was deliberate. It was organized over 2 years with the specific goal of making her feel like she didn't belong in her own home, in her own marriage. His voice was quiet and precise, and each word landed cleanly. And she endured it without telling me because she was trying to protect my relationship with you. Selena's eyes stayed on Nia. Nia didn't look away. She protected you, Roman said, from me finding out what you were doing. For 2 years. He let that sit. Do you understand what I'm saying? She chose you over and over while you were choosing against her. And she did it because she loves me. Something shifted in Selena's face. It was subtle, the kind of shift that happened below the surface of a face that had decades of training in not revealing itself. But it was there. Something had reached her. Not the argument, not the evidence, not the list of incidents. This particular fact. That Nia had spent 2 years absorbing what Selena was doing and had chosen silence not from weakness but from love, for the same person Selena had been claiming to protect. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Selena looked down at her hands. It was the first time Nia had ever seen the woman look at her hands. I need to say something, Nia said. Both of them looked at her. She hadn't spoken since they'd sat down. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which she noted distantly, the way you note things about yourself when you're in the middle of something large. She looked at Selena. I know you believe what you said, Nia said. I know you believe your son's position requires certain things. I know you believe I'm the wrong kind of person for the life he leads. She paused. I've known that from almost the beginning. And for a long time, I thought if I was just patient enough, careful enough, good enough, you would eventually see me differently. She stopped. I was wrong about that. I understand that now. Selena was looking at her with an expression that was unreadable. But I need you to understand something, Nia said. Every time you moved a place card, every time you introduced me as a companion, every time you made sure was served last, you weren't just doing it to me. You were doing it to him. She gestured the smallest motion toward Roman. Because he loves me, which means every act of contempt toward me was an act of contempt toward his choice. His judgment, his life. She held Selena's gaze. You spent 2 years telling your son, through your actions, that what matters most to him is wrong. And you thought you were protecting him. The room was completely still. That's not protection, Nia said. That's something else. She didn't say what the something else was. She didn't need to. Selena's jaw moved. A single, small movement. The movement of someone swallowing something that required effort. Roman stood. When Roman Voss stood in a room, the room organized itself around the fact of him standing. It wasn't size or volume, it was something else, something that lived in how he carried himself, the specific quality of attention he gave the space around him. Every room he was in was slightly more serious than it had been before he was in it. Here's what happens now, he said. His voice was level, not loud, not performative. The voice he used when he had made a decision that was not open to revision. Marcus is out of the legitimate business holdings effective tomorrow. The Ridgeway account, the North District properties, all of it. I'm sending documentation to the board tonight. He paused. He used family loyalty as cover for private benefit. I let it go out of that same loyalty. I'm done extending it. Selena's eyes moved to him. Adrian loses his authority structures in the East District. He loses the Harmon oversight. He keeps his name, he keeps his safety, because he's family, but the influence he's been building on my back is finished. Roman's tone didn't waver. And every person at that table tonight who laughed, who whispered, who participated, they lose access. To my protection, to my resources, to this house. Pause. And you, he said, looking at his mother. Selena was very still. You taught me to protect my family, Roman said. You taught me that the family was the one non-negotiable thing, that everything else, money, power, reputation, everything was in service of that. You told me that 10,000 times in this house. At every table we ever sat at, Selena's eyes hadn't moved from his face. Nia is my family, he said. 3 words. Just 3. But the weight of them in the room was enormous, because every person present understood that Roman Voss did not make statements he hadn't fully examined, did not say things for effect, did not deploy language he didn't mean precisely. Until you can demonstrate, not promise, not claim that you understand what that means, and can treat her accordingly, you don't have a place in our home. He said it, the way he said everything tonight, without heat, without theater. Just clean and clear. And when we have children, which we will, you will have no place in their lives. The word children landed in the room like a stone into still water. Selena's composure, the 30 years of it, the thing she'd built and maintained through more difficulty than most people would encounter in several lifetimes, cracked. Not dramatically, not with tears or volume, just slightly. A fault line visible for a moment before she controlled it back. "Roman," she said. Her voice had lost its architecture. It was just her voice, underneath all the structure, older and less certain. "I'm your mother. I know who you are," he said. "That's why this is the line and not something further." He moved toward the door. "I'll have someone arrange your things," he said. "You're welcome to stay tonight, but I'd like you gone by morning." He stopped at the door. He turned back. He looked at Selena and Nia, watched his face in that moment, watched it do something human and complicated and real. This was not easy for him. Nobody who looked at his face in that moment could have believed it was easy. It was costing him something significant, and he was paying it anyway. And he knew what he was paying, and he was not pretending otherwise. "I love you," he said to his mother, simply, directly. "That's not in question." Then he walked out. Nia stood. She picked up her clutch from the chair. She looked at Selena, who was still seated at the head of the long table, in the chair she'd chosen to assert herself in, which now felt less like authority and more like a woman sitting alone at the wrong end of a consequence she'd spent 2 years building toward. Nia looked at her for a moment. She didn't feel triumphant. She had thought, in the abstract versions of this conversation she'd rehearsed in her head, that some part of her would feel something like satisfaction. She didn't. What she felt was tired in a clean way, the tiredness after a thing is done, not the tiredness of carrying it. "I want you to know something," Nia said. Selena looked up. "I never wanted this," Nia said. "Not any version of this. I wanted a family. I wanted you to be part of our family." She paused. "That's still what I want. That possibility isn't gone." She looked at the older woman steadily. "But I won't pretend it isn't going to cost something to get there. From you. Not from me. Not from Roman." She paused. "From you." Selena looked at her. Her eyes were dark and exhausted and complicated, and for the first time, Nia saw in them something she hadn't seen before, not contempt, not strategy, not the careful management of an agenda. Something that looked, thinly and uncertainly, like the beginning of seeing. "I'm going to find my husband," Nia said, and she walked out. She found Roman in the study down the hall, standing at the window with his back to the door, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the dark of the grounds. She came in and closed the door behind her and stood for a moment. He didn't turn around. "You all right?" she said. He was quiet. "Yeah," he said finally, the word a little rough. She went to him. She didn't say anything else. She stood beside him at the window and looked out at the same dark grounds, and after a moment, he took his right hand out of his pocket and took her hand in it, without looking at her, without ceremony. The way you take hold of something you are not letting go of. They stood like that for a while. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something large has moved through. "She's going to fight it," Nia said eventually. "Not a question." "Probably," Roman said. "Not the leaving. I mean everything else. The understanding. It's going to take a long time." "I know. Are you prepared for that?" He turned and looked at her. In the low light of the study, his face was very clear. She could read everything in it. The grief and the resolve and the exhaustion, and underneath all of it, steady and undisturbed, the thing that had always been there. "Are you?" he said. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. He turned back to the window. Outside, somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. Footsteps. The sound of Selena moving through the upper hall, deliberate, measured, still herself. Whatever she was feeling, she was still herself. Roman's thumb moved over Nia's knuckles. That small, unconscious thing. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm going to need to make about 16 phone calls." "I know. It's going to be complicated. It usually is." A pause. "You should know some of the family is going to take sides. Not everyone is going to understand why I did what I did. I know that too." He looked at her again. "You're not worried?" She thought about it, honestly. Thought about the 14 people at that Easter table. The photograph, the mayor's wife, the cold coffee, and the cold corridor, and 2 years of carrying something that had gotten heavier every month. She thought standing in the kitchen tonight, she thought about standing in the kitchen, listening to the muffled sound of her husband, taking apart the architecture of a campaign that had been built against her, brick by deliberate brick. "I'm not worried," she said, and it was true. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the thing that came before a smile, the precursor to it. "I should have done this a long time ago," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He laughed. Short, quiet, slightly exhausted. Real. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the dark grounds and the distance of the city beyond the estate walls. And Roman Voss stood at the window of his study, with his wife's hand in his, and looked at the city he ran and understood, for the first time in a long time, exactly what he was running it for. The morning was going to be hard. The phone calls would be complicated. The family would fracture in ways that would take years to understand the full shape of. His mother would spend a long time being someone he loved at a distance, which was its own kind of grief. None of that had resolved. All of it was still there, waiting. But in the study, in the quiet, with Nia's weight against his shoulder, Roman breathed in and breathed out and let the night settle around them, and he held on to what was real, and he did not let it go. Outside, in the main hall, Selina Voss sat alone at the long table in silence she had made, and for the first time in 30 years, she had absolutely no idea what happened next. Selina left at 6:47 in the morning. Nia knew the exact time because she was awake, had been awake since 5, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with her knees drawn up and a blanket pulled around her shoulders, watching the sky do the slow, indifferent work of becoming day. She heard the sound of wheels on the gravel drive below the particular crunch and fade of a car moving away from the house, and she didn't go to the window to watch it go. She just sat and listened until the sound was gone and the morning was quiet again. Roman was still asleep. He'd finally gone under sometime around 2. After the phone calls he hadn't been able to put off, and the one conversation with his lawyer that had run 40 minutes, in which Nia had removed herself from out of the same instinct that had always told her where. Her presence helped, and where it complicated things. She'd heard his voice, through the study door low, measured, occasionally with that particular flatness, that meant something was being made unmistakably clear, and eventually the voice had stopped, and he'd come to bed and lain beside her in the dark, without speaking. And she'd reached over and put her hand on his chest, and he'd covered it with his own, and that was how they'd spent the last hours of the night. She looked at him now in the gray early light. He was on his back, one arm across his eyes, the way he slept when he was deeply under. The lines of his face were different when he slept softer, more available, younger, in a way that made her think of the person he might have been if his life had arranged itself differently. If his father had lived. If the weight he'd been carrying since he was 19 had belonged to someone else. She thought about Selina saying, "I held this family together. I made decisions nobody else was willing to make." She thought about how true that probably was. How true it was, and how it had still led here, to a gravel drive at 6:47 in the morning, and sons asleep in a house his mother had just left in the cold. Nothing about this was clean. She had known it wouldn't be. But knowing something won't be clean, and then sitting in the actual texture of its messiness were two different experiences, and she was inside the second one, now, with all its weight. She stayed in the chair until the light was fully gray, and then pale yellow, and then she got up, quietly, and went to make coffee. The 16 phone calls Roman had predicted took 3 days. He made them from the study, from the car, from the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of him, covered in the specific shorthand he used for neat notes, abbreviations, and symbols that she'd long since stopped trying to decode, not out of lack of interest, but out of the understanding that there were rooms in his professional life she was welcome in, and rooms she wasn't. And that distinction was not about exclusion, but about keeping her away from things that would require her to know too much about things she couldn't unknow. She had her own work. The Meridian grant application, which was overdue and which she spent 2 full days completing with the focused efficiency of someone grateful to have something that required her entire attention. She had a visit to one of the program schools on the second day, a Tuesday gray and cold, the kind of morning that made the city look like it was still deciding whether to commit to the day, and she sat in a classroom full of 11-year-olds doing printmaking and watched their faces while they worked, and something in her chest that had been clenched for days loosened a little. Kids didn't know anything about the Voss family. They didn't know anything about place cards or deliberate insults or the architecture of cruelty conducted in expensive rooms. They knew whether their ink was the right consistency and whether the paper was lined up correctly and whether the girl across the table was going to take the brayer they'd been waiting for. Nia sat in a small plastic chair and watched them work and breathed. On the way back, her sister called. Corinne was 4 years older than Nia and lived in Atlanta and had, over the course of Nia's marriage, developed the particular relationship with Roman that close family members of people married to complicated men sometimes develop: a wary, genuine affection, the kind built on the understanding that he made her sister happy while also making her sister's life more difficult, in ways that Corinne tracked privately and commented on rarely. "You sound different," Corinne said. "Different how?" "Like something happened." "Did something happen?" Nia looked out the car window at the city going past. "A lot happened. Good or bad?" She thought about it. "Both," she said, "but mostly necessary." A pause on the line. Corinne processing. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," Nia said. And then, because this was her sister and dishonesty between them had a very short shelf life, "I'm tired." "But yes, I'm okay." "Roman? He's good. He did something I didn't know he had it in him to do, and it cost him. And he did it anyway." Another pause. Longer. "Okay," Corinne said, in the voice she used when she was revising her position on something. "Okay. I want the full story at Christmas, you'll get it." The whole thing. Nothing edited. Corinne. Nothing edited, Nia. "Fine, nothing edited. Good, a beat. I love you." "I love you too." She put the phone down and watched the city and let herself feel for a moment the specific warmth of being known by someone who had known her before she was anyone's wife. Marcus made his move on the 4th day. She found out about it not from Roman, but from the news, a financial publication that ran a brief item about disputed ownership claims in one of the Voss-adjacent holding companies, kind of item that didn't name names explicitly, but was specific enough in its details that anyone who knew the landscape could read exactly what was happening. Marcus was contesting the removal. He had lawyers, apparently, who had been retained quickly enough to suggest he'd had them on standby. She brought her tablet to Roman's study and set it on his desk without a word. He read it. His expression did exactly nothing. "I expected this," he said. "You're not concerned?" "He has a case the way a man holding a broken bottle has a weapon," Roman said. "Technically, yes. Effectively, no." He looked up from the tablet. "I have the documentation, Nia. I've had it for 8 months. The only reason he thinks he has ground to stand on is that I let him believe the ground was solid for longer than I should have." She sat in the chair across from his desk. "He's going to make noise," she said. "For a while. It's going to get into the papers. Some of it." She looked at him. "Is there anything that comes out in that process that I should know about? Before I read it somewhere?" He held her gaze. It was a direct question, and she had asked it directly, and they had been, since the night of the banquet, operating in a different register, with each other more honest, less managed. People sometimes get, after a crisis, strips the insulating layers off a relationship, and you discover that what's underneath is more durable than what you'd built on top of it. "There are things in the history of the business that are not going to look good in public," he said. "Not criminal, not prosecutable, but not things I'd choose to have printed." He paused. "That's always been true. It's not new information. What Marcus's lawyers stir up won't change the fundamental picture. But it'll be uncomfortable." "Yes," she nodded. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right? I knew who you were when I married you, Roman. I'm not going to perform surprise now." She stood up. "Handle it. Tell me what you need from me." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that expression. She had identified the night of the confrontation, the one that was complicated, that had more in it than his face usually showed. Right now, he said, I don't need anything from you, except what you're already doing. Which is, being in the house, he said, staying. She looked at him for a moment. Roman, she said, I'm not going anywhere. I know, he said. I just needed to hear it. Adrian called her directly on the 6th day. She almost didn't answer. She looked at the name on the screen for 3 full rings and considered letting it go to voicemail, where it would sit as a recorded document of whatever he wanted to say, available for later review. Then she answered, because she had spent 2 years avoiding things, and she was not doing that anymore. Nia, he said. Adrian. A pause. He was working up to something. She could hear it in the quality of the silence, the held breath, quality of someone who has rehearsed an opening and is now deciding whether to use it. I owe you an apology, he said. She said nothing. She waited. What I said at the banquet, he said. The things I said to you in the weeks before. He stopped. Started again. I was following my father's lead. I'm not saying that as an excuse. I'm saying it because I want to be accurate about what happened. Another pause. I watched him treat you a certain way, and I decided it was safe to do the same. Because he did it, and nothing happened. A short exhale. That was a miscalculation. It was, she agreed. I'm not, he stopped again. This was not a prepared speech. Could tell, because prepared speeches had a different rhythm, a certain smoothness even when the content was difficult. This was halting in the way of a person doing something genuinely unfamiliar. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm just telling you I know what I did. She stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden, and she thought about Adrian at the banquet, the loose-limbed ease of him, the drink in his hand, the way he'd said phases with such comfort, such certainty that she would absorb it the way she always did. Why are you calling me directly? She said. Because the apology belongs to you, not to Roman. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. It does. I know. He said so. I'm sorry, I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong when I was doing it, which makes it worse. He said it without self-pity. Just flatly. That's all I wanted to say. She held the phone and looked at the garden and thought about what 2 years of this had cost her, not in dramatic terms, not in the way of catastrophic loss, but in the daily small erosions. The mornings she'd woken up already tired, the smile she'd put on in every room that hadn't belonged to her, the version of herself she'd slowly compressed in order to fit into a space that had been made deliberately too small. She thought about whether Adrian's phone call changed any of that. It didn't undo it, but it was something. It was a person who had participated in a harm, choosing to name the harm, without being asked, without the guarantee of absolution. I hear you, she said. That's enough, he said. For now, she said. We'll see about the rest. She ended the call. She stood at the window for a while longer, watching a bird she couldn't identify working at something in the garden, persistent and completely indifferent to anything happening in the house. She envied it, briefly. Then she went back to work. The Marcus situation resolved itself in 3 weeks. Not cleanly, nothing involving lawyers ever resolved cleanly but definitively. Roman had documentation that, when presented in the appropriate context to the appropriate people, left Marcus's position essentially untenable. Marcus fought it for as long as fighting it was more comfortable than stopping, and then he stopped. He retained 2 minor stake positions in peripheral holdings that Roman allowed him to keep, partly because removing them would have required more sustained legal engagement than the value justified, and partly because Naya suspected this. Though Roman never said it directly, he retained them because Marcus was still family, and the gesture cost Roman very little and communicated something he wanted communicated. He was not interested in destruction. He was interested in correction. There was a difference. Not everyone understood it, but it was real. Adrian settled into his reduced position with less resistance than she'd expected. He was, at his core, a person who needed to know where the boundaries were, and who had behaved badly in large part because he'd discovered there were no enforced ones. Now there were. He seemed, if not happier, then more defined, more like a person operating in a space that had clear edges, which turned out to suit him better than the freedom to behave without consequence. He sent Nia a gift, a book she'd mentioned once, months ago, at a gathering she barely remembered, a novel she'd said she hadn't read yet. No note, just the book, with a small slip of paper inside the front cover that said her name in his handwriting, nothing else. She put it on her nightstand and didn't say anything about it to Roman, and eventually she read it, and it was good. Selena was the one that took the longest. Of course she was. She was staying at the family's secondary property, a house in the older part of the city, elegant and well-staffed, not a hardship by any conventional measure. But it was not the main house. It was not the position she had occupied for 30 years. And for a woman whose identity was built as much on her place in the structure as on anything internal, the displacement was its own form of reckoning. Roman spoke to her on the phone every few days. Short conversations, from what Nia could gather, practical things, logistical things, the maintenance of a relationship that had been put on hold rather than ended. He never discussed the content of these calls with her in detail, and she never asked because she understood that Roman's relationship with his mother was not a thing she needed to manage or monitor. It was his to navigate, in whatever pace and manner the two of them could find. She had her own accounting to do, not with Selena, not yet. Timing of that particular conversation was not something she could force, and she'd learned enough about the difference between patience as passivity and patience as strategy to know when waiting was the right action. She was waiting, but she was not waiting quietly, the way she had waited before. She was living her life fully, loudly where she wanted to be loud, with the deliberate presence of a woman who had stopped shrinking to fit spaces that weren't built for her. She attended 2 events that season that she might previously have declined, gatherings in the city where the Voss name carried weight and where she would be observed and noted. She attended them with Roman, and she wore what she wanted, and she spoke with the direct warmth that was her natural register when she wasn't managing herself. And she did not once perform the particular kind of careful pleasantness she'd been performing for 2 years. It was, she realized, exhausting how much energy performing pleasantness had consumed. She had not fully understood the weight of it until she stopped carrying it. At the second event, a gallery opening, a woman she didn't know came up to her and said, "You're Roman Voss's wife, aren't you? I've heard things about you." Nia looked at her. "What kind of things?" The woman smiled. "Good things, actually." She paused. "I knew Elena Vasquez." "She mentioned you." Nia raised an eyebrow. "She said you had remarkable composure," the woman said. "At the anniversary banquet, she said she could tell something was happening in that room, and you just sat there. Like you had decided something." Nia thought about sitting at the wrong end of that table. The single bread roll. The server's apologetic eyes. "I had decided something," she said. "What?" She considered the question honestly. "That I was done deciding things alone," she said. It was 11 weeks after the banquet when Selena came to the house. Not called ahead, not arranged. She appeared at the door on a Thursday morning. Nia opened it herself because Roman was in the study and she'd been nearest the entrance, and Selena was standing on the step in a charcoal coat with her hands at her sides and her face carrying something that was unfamiliar on it. Something that had cost her to get here. Something that was visible in the set of her shoulders in a way that was different from all the other ways Nia had seen her hold herself. She looked older than she had at the banquet. Not dramatically, but the particular kind of older that happens when something internal has shifted, when the structure a person has been holding up is no longer being held in quite the same way. Nia stood in the doorway and said nothing. Selena looked at her. "I would like to come in," Selena said. "A beat." "Is Roman here?" Selena said. "He is," Nia said. "But that's not who you need to talk to first." Selena's chin moved fractionally. She understood this. She absorbed it without the defensive reorganization that Nia would have expected 2 months ago. "No," Selena said. "It isn't." Nia held the door open. Selena came in. They sat in the smaller sitting room off the main hall. Not the grand dining room, not the study, not any of the rooms that carried the specific weight of what had happened. This room was quieter, furnished in a way that felt less like a statement and more like a place. 2 chairs and a low table, and the morning light coming through the south-facing window at a low angle. Selena sat. Nia sat. They looked at each other. "I have spent 11 weeks," Selena said, "trying to find a way to have this conversation that allows me to maintain some part of what I believe I was doing correctly." She said it without preamble, without the social scaffolding she normally used. Just directly, in the stripped-down way she'd spoken that night in the kitchen. "I have not been able to find one." Nia waited. "Everything I did," Selena said, "I did because I believed it was in service of my son's interests. His stability, his future." She paused. "I believe that sincerely. I want you to know I'm not the kind of person who does cruel things for the pleasure of it." "I know that," Nia said. "That's actually part of what made it so difficult." Selena looked at her. "If you'd been doing it for pleasure," Nia said, "it would have been easier to dismiss. Easier to stay angry at." She held Selena's gaze. "But you believed you were right. And you were capable and organized. And you had decades of experience managing this family. Which meant every single thing you did was done well." She paused. "That's a specific kind of damage. The kind that comes from someone competent." Selena was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't see you," she said finally. "No. I decided what you were before I looked." She said it simply. The admission of someone who has spent a significant amount of time arriving at a simple truth and is now willing to say it out loud. "I decided what you represented to the family, to Roman's position, to the future I had planned for him, and I stopped looking at you as a person." A pause. "That's not something I can excuse." Nia listened. "The toast," Selena said. "At the banquet. When I said," she stopped. "A brief, visible difficulty. When I talked about things that don't belong inside what we've built." She looked at her hands on her knees. "I said that in front of people who know what I meant. And you were sitting in that room." "I was. I want to tell you that She stopped again. "There's no version of that I can soften." "I said it." "You heard it. Roman heard it." She looked up. "I have thought about the particular words I used for 11 weeks. Every morning I wake up and I think about them." Nia was quiet. "What do you want me to say?" Selena asked. And it was a genuine question, not defensive, not strategic. Question of a woman who was trying to navigate something she didn't have a map for. "I will say what I need to say. I want to know what actually reaches you. Not what sounds right. What reaches you." It was, Nia thought, the most honest thing Selena Voss had ever said to her. She took a breath. "I want you to understand," Nia said, "that the place card was not a small thing." Selena nodded. "I know it seems small," Nia said, "one card, one table. But I want you to sit with what it meant for me to walk into that room, into a room in my own family's house, and watch someone pick up my name and move it to a different location without speaking to me, without acknowledging what they were doing." She paused. "I want you to sit with what I did next. I want you to think about the fact that I walked to the end of that table and sat down and smiled at the server who brought me water. Because the alternative was making a scene, and making a scene would have hurt Roman, and I was not willing to hurt Roman." Selena was very still. "I did that," Nia said, "at Easter. And at the photograph, and at the gala, and at every dinner between then and the banquet. I made myself smaller and quieter and more manageable every time you arranged things to tell me I didn't belong. And I did it because I love your son." She paused. Her voice was steady. "I need you to know that I am not angry at you for a single act. I am telling you the shape of what 2 years of it looks like from the inside." Selena's jaw moved. The same small movement as in the kitchen. The swallowing of something. "I understand," Selena said. Quietly, "Do you?" Pause. "I'm beginning to," Selena said. "I think understanding it fully is going to take longer than 11 weeks. Nia looked at her. "Yes," she said, "it is." They sat in the quiet for a moment. "What I want," Nia said, "is not an apology that cleans everything up. I've had enough of clean surfaces covering difficult things. What I want is for you to do the work. The actual work." She held Selena's gaze. "Not because Roman will know. Not because there are consequences. Because you choose to look at what you did and decide to be different." She paused. "That's all I'm asking for. But I'm asking for all of it." Selena looked at her for a long time. And then Selena Voss, who had not asked anyone for anything in 30 years without knowing exactly what the answer would be, said, "I would like to try." 3 words. Not a guarantee, not a promise with the full architecture of certainty behind it. Just 3 words with all the uncertainty that honesty requires. Naya looked at them and decided they were enough to start with. "All right," she said. She told Roman that evening. Not the full detail of the conversation, some of it was between her and Selena, existed in the space between 2 women who had been in a specific conflict and were navigating out of it in the particular way that such conflicts required, which didn't always benefit from a third party's front presence, even when the third party was the man they both loved. But she told him his mother had come, that they'd spoken, that it was a beginning, not a conclusion, not a resolution, but a genuine beginning in the way that beginnings actually felt, which was uncertain and tentative and real. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like something very heavy has been put down," she said. "And like I can feel in my arms what it weighed." He nodded slowly. "Good or bad?" "Neither. Just true." He reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else needed. The holidays came. They spent them differently than they had the year before, more selectively, with a deliberate attention to which rooms they chose to be in and whose company they sought. They went to Corinne's in Atlanta for 5 days at Christmas, which was the first time Roman had spent that kind of extended time with Nia's family, and which produced 3 days of initial wariness on Corinne's part, and then an evening where Corinne and Roman somehow ended up in a sustained argument about basketball, not unpleasant, intensely competitive, that Nia watched from the other side of the living room with a warmth so acute it was almost painful. Her mother, who had been skeptical of Roman since the beginning, and had communicated this skepticism in the specific way of a Southern woman of a certain generation, never directly, always precisely sat beside him at Christmas dinner and showed him a photograph of Nia at 14, braces and a look of absolute certainty on her face, and said she always knew exactly what she wanted, even when she was wrong about it. Roman looked at the photograph for a moment. "I can see that," he said, and smiled. Her mother looked at him. Then she looked at Naya across the table, and she gave a small nod, the kind that communicated significant things in very small motion, and passed the sweet potatoes. January brought the kind of cold that made the city feel stripped down to its bones, all the warmth and softening of the season gone, everything revealed in the clear, harsh light. Naya liked January, for that reason always had, the honesty of it. She was working on a new program and expansion of the Meridian Arts Initiative into 3 additional schools, which was larger than anything she'd done before, and which required a level of organizational work that consumed most of her days in a way she found genuinely satisfying. She had hired 2 new staff members and was in the process of negotiating a partnership with a larger arts organization that had been circling them since the previous year's grant awards. She realized one morning, building something, not managing something, not holding something together, not enduring something until it becomes something else, actually building, with intention and appetite, in a direction she had chosen. The realization arrived while she was standing in her home office, reading a contract for the 3rd time, and it arrived so quietly that she almost missed it, just a small recognition, like a room you've been in for years, suddenly showing you a window you hadn't noticed. She put the contract down. She looked at the room around her, her books, her work spread across the desk, the photograph of her and Roman from the previous spring that had somehow ended up framed on the corner shelf, both of them squinting slightly against the sun. Roman with his jacket off and that almost smile he had, her with her head turned toward him and her hand at his arm. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up the contract and went back to reading. The next family gathering was in February. Smaller than the anniversary banquet, a dinner at the main house, 8 people, organized not by Selena, but by one of the younger cousins, who had taken on some of the social coordination that had previously run through the matriarch. Selena was invited. She came. Nia spent no time in the morning deciding what to wear. She chose the emerald dress, the deep green one. The color Roman had said she looked extraordinary in because it was the dress she wanted to wear, and because she was done calibrating her choices against other people's expectations. She wore her hair up, which she'd been told once by someone she could no longer identify was too severe for family dinners, a comment she'd absorbed without comment, and which had apparently lodged itself in her decision-making for longer than she'd realized. Because she noticed the tiny resistance before she chose the updo and identified it as someone else's voice in her own head, and then did the thing anyway. She came downstairs and Roman looked at her from the kitchen doorway, just looked, for a moment. "Ready," she said. "When you are," he said. They drove to the dinner. Roman had the radio on, a jazz station he returned to with the reliability of habit, and Nia watched the city go past the window and felt the ordinary miracle of being on her way to a family dinner, without the familiar compression in her chest that she'd spent 2 years treating as normal. They arrived. Nia walked in. She found her place card. It was beside Roman's. Nobody had moved it. She stood at the table for a moment, looking at the card with her name on it, Nia Voss, in the formal script that the family used for these things, and she felt something pass through her that she didn't immediately categorize. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something older and quieter than either of those. The feeling of a thing that should have been true being true, which was not dramatic when it finally happened, just correct. Just finally correct. She sat down. Across the table, Petra, the young cousin, the one with the apologetic eyes at the banquet, caught her gaze and held it for a moment. She looked different from how she'd looked that night. Less anxious, or anxious about different things. She gave Nia a small, genuine smile, not the performance of a smile, just a person's face doing an honest thing, and Nia gave one back. Roman sat beside her. He looked at the room the way he always did, cataloging. Then he looked at Nia. "Okay," he said. "Yes," she said. He took her hand on top of the table. Not under it, the way he'd done in hiding at previous dinners, that private tuck gesture of solidarity that existed just below visibility. On top of the table, in the light, where anyone could see. Nobody commented. Nobody looked away. Nia turned her head and looked at him, and he was already looking at her, and there was nothing in his face that required interpretation. It was just Roman, in full, without the layers, the man who had spilled wine on her coat, who had learned to say he was sorry, who had stood in a doorway long enough to understand what he'd been failing to see and had then done something about it. Not perfectly. Not without cost or complication or the ongoing work that everything real required. But genuinely, just Roman. Her hand was warm in his. Selena arrived 20 minutes into the meal. She had been delayed something logistical, the city traffic at this hour, and she came in with the slightly abbreviated entrance of someone who knows they're late and is moving efficiently to minimize the disruption. She wore dark blue. Her hair was the same as always, precise and deliberate. But she moved differently through the room. Something in it was less territorial, less the survey of a woman checking the condition of her domain. She moved like a person attending rather than presiding. She found her seat, which was not at the head of the table. That had been a quiet reorganization of the seating convention. No announcement, no confrontation, just a different arrangement that everyone present understood the meaning of. She sat. She greeted the people nearest her. She accepted the wine that was poured. She looked across the table, and her eyes moved to Nia. They held the look for a moment. Then Selena lifted her glass, not in a toast, just a small lift. A gesture that occupied the space between acknowledgement and something more, something that didn't have an established form yet, but was trying to find one. Nia lifted hers in return. That was all. No performance of warmth. No pretend softening of the history between them. Just two women agreeing, in a small motion over a dinner table, to continue the work. Later that night, after the dinner had wound down and the guests had filtered out, and Roman was in the car waiting, Nia stood in the entry hall for a moment before leaving a last look at a room that had held so many difficult things and was now holding something else, something that didn't have a single name but felt like the beginning of it. She thought about the Easter dinner, standing at the far end of that table. Bread roll placed as an afterthought, the server's uncomfortable eyes. She thought about standing in the bathroom at the banquet, looking at herself in the mirror, her hands cold under the running water, thinking she could manage it alone, telling herself one more time that she was fine. She thought about the corridor, and Selena's voice through the barely closed door, and the particular quality of understanding that arrives when you finally see the full shape of what you've been living inside. She thought about Roman standing in the kitchen doorway saying, "I should have been in this with you from the start." She thought about Corinne saying, "I want the whole story. Nothing edited." She thought about a classroom of 11-year-olds doing printmaking, and a bird in the garden, and a book on her nightstand with just her name inside the cover. She thought about 2.5 years of smiling when she meant something else, and the specific cost of that, and what it had taken to arrive at a dinner table and find her place card exactly where it should have been, and feel nothing more dramatic than, yes. This, finally. She had not arrived here by being without fault. She'd been wrong about the silences, had been wrong about how long it was sustainable, wrong about whether protecting Roman from the choice meant the choice wouldn't eventually come anyway. She had confused endurance with wisdom. She had let something that was harming her continue for longer than it should have, because she was afraid of the cost of stopping it, and the cost of stopping it was very high, and she had been right about that it had been very high. But she was here, in an entry hall that was finally unmistakably her own. She turned and walked out to the car. The cold hit her face when the door opened, sharp and clean, the honest January cold. Roman had the engine running, the interior warm. She got in. He looked at her, that reading the room look, but easier now, less like surveillance and more like attention. "Good night," he said. "Yes," she said. It was. He put the car in gear. The estate receded behind them, lit up in the winter dark, and the city opened up ahead, the particular brightness of it, all those lights, all those lives running in parallel in the cold. Naya leaned her head back against the seat and looked at the city going past, and she let herself feel, without qualifying it, without managing it into something smaller and safer and more appropriate. For a woman who was still figuring out her place, she let herself feel that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had arrived somewhere final, not because the work was done. The work was not done, it would keep being work, the marriage and the family and the particular ongoing effort of being known and knowing, which was what all of it was really about. Underneath the dinners and the place cards and the campaigns and the confrontations. But she was here, present whole, undiminished. Naya Holloway Voss, in an emerald dress, in a warm car, in a city that didn't know her name and didn't need to. That was enough. That was, she thought, everything.